Tēnā koto, tēnā koto, tēnā koto katoa. Kia ora tātou, and welcome to the 5th webinar of the RAS Symposium series. Today, we're focusing on mental health. My name's Brady Kean, and I'm the Clinical Director, and today I'm joined by several of my colleagues. Devash Naidu is a Clinical Team Leader from the Mangrey Refugee Resettlement Centre and has worked both offshore and onshore with people from refugee backgrounds. Linda Crisford, a psychologist who has a special interest in working with those who are seeking asylum. Claire Power, our child psychologist who predominantly works at Mangrey Refugee Resettlement Centre, but since the COVID crisis has been working more in the community with our families who settled here in Auckland. Barry Vautier, a very experienced body therapist who's worked both at Mangrey Refugee Resettlement Centre and also extensively in the community. And last but not least, Jelani Abisinga, who's our social worker who has an extensive amount of knowledge of working in the mental health sector. So RAS New Zealand provides specialist mental health and wellbeing interventions for anybody from a refugee background. We provide support in Mangrey Refugee Resettlement Centre and also for those who've been settled in Auckland in the community. Our central philosophy is that being a refugee is not a diagnosis. It's a journey, it's an experience, and we approach all of our interventions, whether they be psychological, whether they're psychosocial, or community-based, from a cross-cultural and trauma-informed position with this in mind. Today, my colleagues here will give a brief overview of their roles at RAS, their approaches, and some of their learnings about working alongside this population. There will be room for questions, so please feel free to pop your questions in the question and answer box. And if we don't get to your questions, we're really happy to follow up and provide support at any time. An hour will go very quickly, and so with this in mind, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Devash.
Kia ora, Kate. For those of you who are familiar with the sector or have been following our RAS Symposium series, you will well be aware that the refugee journey is a forced displacement process. This is often precipitated, for example, by religious, racial, or political persecution, war, famine, and/or gender and sexual orientation discrimination. Now, internationally, climate change is fast becoming a recognized driver for resource-related conflict and forced migration. The protracted and arduous journey to host and possibly secondary host countries can have significant psychological consequences. The World Health Organization 2019 statistics pertaining to mental health in emergency contexts quotes, among people who have experienced war or other conflict in the previous 10 years, 1 in 11, which is 9%, will have a moderate to severe mental health disorder, unquote. The WHO prevalence reviews go on to assert that most people in emergency contexts will experience psychological distress. However, most will improve or recover over time. Now, the indulgence of addressing mental health concerns can be extremely limited. Primary concerns addressed in emergency contexts are usually medical in nature, and when mental health is addressed, it's often biomedical in approach. Mental health may be considered culturally unacceptable and also encompassed in that negative stereotype which conceptualizes addressing mental health as being crazy. In my experience with international humanitarian work offshore, opportunities for mental health care can involve PFA, which is a psychological first aid, and other forms of brief-term interventions. On arrival in New Zealand and at Mangrey Refugee Resettlement Centre, all former refugees are assigned New Zealand residency status. Access to mental health intervention is available to all residents with an offer to support resettlement adjustment. Now, this may involve managing rational anxieties with language integration, different cultural norms, or familial expectations. Referrals can be self-made, and this is done following our psychoeducation groups or made via on-site interagency colleagues. As Kate has pointed out, it's important to keep in mind that the refugee journey may be fraught with trauma. It is not necessarily diagnostic or requiring of labeling. We hold at the forefront of our mind that this is an incredibly resilient population group. RAS provides an opportunity for focus on culturally informed, holistic trauma intervention. This will be elaborated upon by my colleagues Barry, who will speak to the mind-body duality and the role of body therapy in trauma processing, and Jelani, who will speak to social work and the RAS wraparound service to well-being. Now, the use of culturally informed trauma practice, in which the voice of the client is offered via our interpreters, is an essential component of our one-to-one and group therapeutic processes. Assessment and ongoing recommendations to resettlement locations is our primary focus at Mangrey, and our RAS mobile team can assist those settled in Auckland with continuity of longer-term mental health care. Now, I consider my role as a clinical psychologist as RAS to hold an exceptionally privileged position, as the relational engagement experienced with RAS may be one of the first mental health opportunities afforded to former refugees or asylum seekers, or it could also be a corrective experience by way of having a chance to destigmatize and erode the myths around psychological intervention. This has been a foundational overview of the offshore to onshore journey and our services at RAS. My colleagues will share aspects of their experiences and the work with our population group. We hope to give you a comprehensive understanding of our aim to make an empowered contribution as a specialized refugee mental health service. I'll hand back to you, Kate. Kira.
Kira Devash, that was a beautiful introduction to the work that we do, both in the centre and in the community, and a great reflection. I'd now like to hand over to my colleague Linda, who could introduce a little more around the work that we do with those seeking asylum.
Thanks, Kate. So I thought I'd start by just giving a brief, well, not a definition, but a difference between asylum seekers, quota refugees, and migrants. So your asylum seeker is someone who has applied for protection as a refugee to New Zealand and they're waiting for their status. A quota refugee has already been accepted to New Zealand as a permanent resident, and a migrant is someone who chooses to come to New Zealand and is able to make decisions, often can speak the language, can go back home. So in terms of my work with asylum seekers, I find that there's a lot of stress that asylum seekers experience, and some of those things are financial difficulties, difficulty getting the documentation that they need for their hearing, and also evidence for that. There's a loss of control, financial difficulties, separation from their family, trauma experience. Sometimes they've been imprisoned in New Zealand as well, which exacerbates the previous trauma that they've had. And one client I worked with told me about how shocked he was to find himself in prison because he'd never done anything wrong. And so that was very traumatic for him. It takes a lot of time for the decision process, and that's challenging to wait. There's a lot of fear and distrust and isolation. And just to elaborate a little bit more on those 3 points, the fear is associated with a couple of things. One is the fear of being deported, but also a fear of who they can trust to talk to. They don't like social conversations being asked about what do you do, where are you from, because they're frightened to reveal their journey here in case it impacts on the safety of loved ones behind. Work visas, often asylum seekers are granted work visas, but sometimes they aren't. And just to give you an example of a young man that I worked with, he'd been in New Zealand for 3 years and was not entitled to a work visa. He was living in the community. It was very challenging for him because he wanted to contribute to New Zealand. And one of the things that was also very difficult with not having a work visa, he has no ID. So it was difficult for him to volunteer for organisations, and even basic things like taking a library book home to read. He couldn't join the library because he had no ID. In terms of psychological presentations that we often see, it's post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, grief and loss, shame and guilt, sleep difficulties, suicidal ideation and self-harm. So in terms of our treatment approach, it's slightly different with asylum seekers compared to quota refugees. And that difference is that they're not in a safe place to be able to process the trauma. So by that I mean physically they are safe, they're in New Zealand, but emotionally they're not well enough, or safe enough, sorry, I should say, to be able to process that. So they're often very distressed by the time they're referred to RAS. And this is because usually they've been declined at refugee status unit, and often their Immigration Protection Tribunal hearing is imminent. They're a high risk group. Their sense of hopelessness and helplessness feeds into a lot of suicidal ideation at times. So a lot of our work is around safety planning and onward referral to the crisis team if they are suicidal. And that's because RES can't provide a 24-hour service, so we can't give that full wraparound care. We're often working on tools to stay present and manage symptoms like nightmares and worries. Put a lot of preparation into preparing for the Immigration Protection Tribunal hearing. That's if there's time permitting. And it's about teaching strategies to manage the hearing process, which is often very triggering for them because they have to go into detail about their trauma. The risk with this is that they get caught up in their trauma memories, they can't concentrate, and so by providing some strategies to be able to stay present gives them a better chance of focusing on the questions. I like to try and take them to visit Immigration Protection Tribunal before their hearing so that they can, outside of it, they can visualise the hearing, and in our sessions we can practice strategies. Immigration Protection Tribunal staff are really helpful in this, and they will, if they can, they'll let us go into a vacant hearing room and we can practice our strategies in there. Clients' feedback has been that it's very helpful to go through this process and that it does help them stay grounded during the hearing process. Another thing that we will do is provide a support letter to the lawyer about the psychological presentation of the client. That's if the lawyer requests that. So that's sort of a brief overview of the things that we do.
Thanks, Linda. That was a very thorough overview of the work that you and your colleagues do when we're supporting people who are seeking asylum. So now I'd like to hand over to Claire for some of your reflections on your role as a child psychologist and your experiences both in Mangrey and what you notice in the community.
Kia ora, everybody. My name is Claire Power, and I work as one of the psychologists at the Mangrey Refugee Centre. I work with the children and families as the clinician for the children and families at the Refugee Centre. And I also, of course, work with children who are coming into New Zealand as separated minors. So that is some of the clientele that I would see. When families arrive in New Zealand, they are in a state of upheaval and transition because everything in New Zealand is so new. Every family arrives with their own unique experiences. And like already been mentioned, refugee families have been exposed to a variety of different adversities like violence, compromised safety, impoverished conditions, discrimination, racism, loss and grief, and trauma. What is important to remember that for many of the children, they also, as well as these adversities, they also bring with them intergenerational trauma. So they also hold on to the trauma that their families or family members have brought with them. Interestingly, some of the backgrounds of these extreme adversity, I also am privileged to see a great amount of resiliency. The children settle in quite nicely to the refugee centre. I think it's something to do about being safe. The structure and routines that are provided at the centre go a long way to helping families settle. So I only see a very small proportion of students and children and youth who come through. Some of the mental health presentations that I would see would include things like separation anxiety. For example, some of the children may have never been to school. Certainly for the very young ones, they may have never been to preschool, so separation anxiety is quite high. Hypervigilance in the classroom or particular sensitivity to loud noises, things like that, extreme fear. Food and sleeping practices can be disrupted. When I'm talking about food, sometimes you might see some unusual food practices, like the children might be hiding food or hoarding food, or some of them just don't like the diet, the new diet. It's all changes for them, and so everything can be very stressful. And that's some of the things that we do see. We see some bedwetting, emotional dysregulation, and probably some reactive behaviour where they're just not used to some of the new things that are around them. They haven't been social with peers before, maybe hiding away. So there's all sorts of presentations that might be on referrals. Generally speaking, I would say it's the parents who are referring their children to see me, but also referrals can come in through from teachers and medical staff and INZ caseworkers and community staff members, now that I'm a little bit more in the Auckland community team. Yeah, those are the sorts of things that I would see. Part of my role is to gather in the stories and document some of that background so that we can inform agencies as the children and families move on from the refugee centre. I think that's a summary of what I do. If I've skipped on anything, I'll talk further in the questions as they come through.
That's great. Thank you so much, Claire. Okay, now I'd like to hand over to my colleague Barry to talk more, as Devarsh said, about that mind-body duality. Just pop yourself off mute, Barry.
Sorry about that. Had the sound off. I'm Barry Gauthier, and I'm a body therapist. I work part-time at the Refugee Centre, and also with the mobile team, which is based in Onehunga. We have both male and female body therapists part-time. The reason being is that we work culturally appropriately, so men on men, woman on woman. The clients are sent to us either from the medical team or from counsellors, or sometimes they also self-refer. Now, why do they come to us? Well, because they're in pain. And the pain is not just physical, but it's also mental. So we consider a mind-body approach to our work in that when we have thoughts and feelings, those are often expressed in our body. For example, if we are fearful, we'll hold tension in our body. If we have anxiety, we might feel fearful. Our breathing might be shallow, for example. And so we found that having body therapy is a great way to access a person's calm state. So when a person is very anxious, they might be hyper-aroused, they might be jittery, they might be holding a lot of fear in their body that has been there for a long time. And so by having body therapy, that some of that anxiety and fear can be overcome. So we take people from a state of fight or flight into a state of steady state, from state of being in the sympathetic aspect of the autonomic nervous system to the parasympathetic aspect of the autonomic nervous system, to put it in medical terms. We see a lot of people with trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, but I also see people who have had some injuries. They might have injured themselves along the way sometimes, or sustained injuries, like from anything from torture to a bomb blast. There's a lot of stress from dislocation, and there's a lot of fear of the unknown. And so the Mangrey Resettlement Centre provides a great opportunity and breathing space for people to come into a little bit of a peaceful time for 6 weeks and before they go out into the community. As I said, some of the people are very hyper aroused and they might be on edge. They can be very sensitive to pain, and I can barely touch them. And some people are the opposite. They've turned off their pain reception, and they're very hard to connect and very disassociated, and they can be quite hard to work with. It's great that we can have this collaboration in terms of being able to cross-refer with counselling, social work, medical team, we can work collaboratively with a client to get the best outcome for them. In the end, the pathway is to provide someone with relief. So often that relief is something very simple, like getting better sleep, being able to be more present and make better decisions, and in fact, just simply have pain relief. That's about it from me for now.
Thanks, Barry. That's a great introduction to the duality between the mind and the body work, and I'm sure that will be picked up more later in the questions section. Delani, over to you.
Thank you, Kate. Kia ora. I'm a social worker based within our community team in Onehunga, which means that I work with people from all refugee backgrounds, whether that be quarter refugees, conventional refugees, asylum seekers, and those that arrive under the family reunification and family support categories. Some of the most common social issues and needs that our client population presents are around housing, access to education and employment, unhealthy family dynamics, domestic violence, social isolation, and financial difficulties. Of course, the nature and the level of need varies for a multitude of personal but also structural reasons. So understanding the client's needs from an ecological perspective, I believe, allows me to understand the various systems at play in the client's life and help me work with clients in partnership to appropriately address the presenting issues. The ecological perspective is congruent with trauma-informed practice, and given that we work with a population that has suffered significant trauma, this is highly relevant. And if I am to describe what I do in 3 words, it would be empower, advocate, and negotiate. Empower the clients by initially walking alongside them to navigate and problem solve to reduce social and personal barriers. Advocate on behalf of the clients. I often find that clients are not receiving the necessary support or services that are available to them by, say, for example, hospitals following a medical procedure. It is the case if you don't ask, you don't receive. Interpreters are often not used by GP practices, WINs, and even hospitals, just to name a few, even though this should be a standard procedure. Asylum seekers often miss out on financial assistance from WINs that they are entitled to. This is purely because call center staff or even sometimes case managers not knowing the legislations around asylum seeker entitlements. And the last one is negotiating between what the clients feel they need and what the services and systems in New Zealand can offer. This is probably the hardest part of my work because often services and systems are not set up to provide for some of the needs of the clients. But I find that honest, open and respectful communication and a good working relationship with clients are integral to this process, but as well as the overall, as well as my work overall. Yeah, that's from me for now.
Thanks, Delani. Another great introduction to the work that you do, you and your team do in the social work aspect of RAS. Now, you've all touched on it a little so far, but I'm just wondering if you can talk a little about the benefits of coming from a multidisciplinary team and how that kind of helps support the client group that we work with. Anybody like to start us off?
Well, I'm happy to start us off on that, Kate. I think working in a multidisciplinary team informs our ethos on being on a holistic and culturally informed service. I think on the screen today you see just a few of the scopes that we have, but one of I think the aspects that we lean to very strongly are cross-cultural facilitators, for example, and getting that advice, that cultural informed advice, really impacts how we can positively engage with our clients. So I think that that's the benefit for us, is that we can then lean into ensuring that our practice is culturally informed with that clinical backing behind it.
Yes, I can add to that.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay, Barry, you go.
Oh, well, I was just going to say that working collaboratively is a great advantage for the client in that they might often reveal things, for example, to me on the massage table, which within confidence, I can report that to the psychologist who's working with them. So they're aware of that confidentiality, but it can be hugely beneficial in terms of adding to their outcomes, and vice versa. Sometimes the counsellor will report things to me, inform me of how I can work, say, more culturally appropriately with that client. Claire, over to you.
Okay, I was just going to say it's really important to have that multi-agency approach or multi-dimensional approach, because it allows us to see the client, keeping the client in the centre, see them from a variety of different lenses, and especially in terms of behaviour, when children are using behaviour as their first language to communicate their distress. Sometimes their behaviour can be different in different settings. So it's what I might see in clinic might be different to what the classroom teacher is seeing, might be different to what the parents are seeing. And so to be able to get together, to be able to share that information and really sort of tune in to what's going on for the clients, it is really important. The other thing I'd like to add is, in order, from my perspective, in order to provide some support to children, I just see it as absolutely critical that we can provide support to their parents, because when children can see that their families are supported, and when the parents feel supported, they're obviously put in a better state to then provide that onward support to their children as that backflow. So that's just what I'd like to add there.
Thanks.
Could I just add something as well? So as well as working collaboratively with the team at Onehanga, so say be the body therapist or the therapist or the psychologist, I do a lot of work with the RAS youth team as well, given that we work with families and there are lots of needs concerning the children that the adults and the parents are concerned about. So it's a very multidisciplinary, very holistic sort of approach that we work from.
I think it's pretty much all been said. I really like the collaboration between colleagues, and I think it is really advantageous for our clients. Things like being able to go to the social worker, because often social issues will come up in my sessions, and to be able to get support for them with that then frees up the space once that's been addressed to be able to help more with the psychological side of things.
Fantastic. Thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, can I also add the importance of the interpreters that we work with, because I often say that I can't do the work without the interpreters. That's quite integral to our work as well. Sorry.
Absolutely. I mean, the interpreters are an essential part of all of the work that we do, and they're definitely a very active part of our team here at RAS. And it may be picked up more in the next question. RAS works from a position of cross-cultural trauma-informed practice, and I'm wondering if each of you could maybe make some comments on what that means to you and how that is seen within the work that you do with your clients.
Yeah. So I think one of the benefits of our training is that ability to be self-reflective, Kate. And I think an awareness for me is the important part of working with my clients. So awareness of the social construction that has led me to have the beliefs that I do, the bias that I do. So my background truly informs how I will practice. And I think that my training, particularly because it comes from a Western-based model, is important to consider in terms of my practice. And that willingness to respectfully listen and understand the worldview of the client and the cultural differences that might exist. So, for example, if they have beliefs with regards to the presence of voices, post-grief process, for example, not necessarily hallucinatory in practice, but understanding what that means for the person. I think that's what it means to be culturally informed. And I think it expands on from that question in terms of that multidisciplinary team. It's about understanding from my colleagues So if we use a contextual framework as a parallel, so if we think about Tafari Tapafai, in that the psychological aspect is in terms of attending to the mind, whereas body therapy might be attending to the physical and the body, and we're looking at social aspects and community in terms of the whānau and even some of that wairua in terms of cross-cultural facilitated background in terms of religion and culture. I think that's what it means for me, is to utilize all of that to make sure that when I'm engaging, it's meaningful for the client.
I'd like to speak to that as well. Very much what I do is culturally informed, in that first of all, getting informed consent from the client and being able to discuss with the client through this interpreter quite often. So we're very dependent on our interpreters to provide us with information about the client, and also to be able to ask questions that are culturally appropriate. One of the things that comes up in body therapy in particular is whether I work through clothing or not. So I give them the option: would you like me to work directly on the skin, or would you prefer if I just work through clothing? And very occasionally, someone will even turn down body therapy because the touch is such an issue for them. That's not so common though, because in most cultures, massage is a part of their heritage, and they understand massage. But they may not understand the massage I do, so I have to explain very carefully what I would like to do with them, and get concurrence for that. Part of that cultural appropriateness is just simply having an inquisitive inquiry into the person that's in front of me, and not putting my prejudices in front. Can I be unshockable, for example, because often their stories are quite shocking. They're overwhelmingly shocking, and one of the things we have to be careful about as practitioners is that we don't suffer secondary trauma. And so we support each other in that. We have team meetings to support each other, plus we can support each other individually. One of the great things of working collaboratively. Thank you.
If I could just add just a little bit to that, because you guys have summed it up so much, so there's only a tiny bit, but for me it's just not casting judgment. I mean, when parents and families are under a huge amount of stress, they need reassurance, and they can often be, they can feel that they're being judged, and so there's particular practices that parenting practices that they might be using that are not used over here, and so that causes further anxiety. It's just important for them to not feel that they're being judged, and that we can use other methods to sort of try and inform the way that they go from here.
I mean, everyone's covered quite a lot of things, but one of the things I'd like to add to it is working from a cultural humility, humility framework. And one of those aspects is being really self-reflective in session and out of session, and looking for cues that you might be missing. And to give you an example, I had a situation with a client where told me he was feeling sad because his daughter had gone to school with a sandwich and black tea. Now, I sensed that I'd missed something really important, but you know, sandwiches are normal to me. And so I spoke to the interpreter after session, and what he had told me was an example of extreme poverty within his family, because in his culture you never send a child to school with a sandwich, it's always rice. And yes, they always go to school with tea, but it always has milk in it. And so having used the services of the interpreter from that cultural perspective, I was able to go back next session and pick up on that and just explore it a bit further. And so I think it's really important to utilise the skills of your interpreter and cross-cultural facilitators.
Just to add a little bit more, because everyone's done such a great job. For me, it's that, but also going with an open mind. That not all that culture is fluid. that not all people from certain backgrounds behave or think in certain ways. Given my own background, I'm Sri Lankan, but because of my various journeys across various different countries, those experiences have influenced the way I behave and I think. So I think it's quite important that you don't go to sessions or you don't engage with clients with preconceived notions of how they might behave or think just because they're of a certain culture. So I think it's quite important to be open-minded and respectful.
Thanks, Delaney. Those are some really great points. I've just been taking a look at some of the questions that are coming through, and maybe we can start attending to some of those now. So Claire, a few questions have come through in regards to working with separated minors in Mangrey. Maybe if you have some reflections on what the processes are and some of your experience working with this particular group.
Okay, so yes, it is a group that requires a lot of attention as they come through the Mangrey Refugee Centre. Some of the children who are coming to join their families have been separated from their families for a very long time. The families will come and stay with them while they are staying at the Mangrey Centre. But it's a really complex issue. It brings with it so many complexities. What have their experiences been? Have they been connected to their families in New Zealand? What are their expectations? There's so many things there. It's a very complex issue, and it requires a big team of professionals and ongoing support as the children transition from the centre into the community, just to make sure that things go smoothly. A lot of professionals become involved.
And what does that look like in the refugee centre? What team would be working with those young people who have been separated from their families and are coming to be rejoined, rather than children who are coming by themselves without any family here in New Zealand?
Sorry, can you say that question again, Kate? Are you talking about the JAR process where we get together with a multi-agency approach and we are sharing information as it comes through as to how things are going for the children at the school, as they come through clinic sessions, as they work with their caseworkers through Immigration New Zealand? I think it's really important to keep that communication tie very strong, so that we're all sort of working together and not missing anything as the children are settling into their new lives.
Fantastic. And AUT have also got a great part to play in that, I understand, in regards to then into the communities from an education.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Claire. Now, Barry, there seems to be a lot of interest in body therapy, and a couple of questions in regards to the training that one may need to be able to do body therapy in this kind of setting. I'm wondering if you can speak a little to that for us today.
Yeah, I'm fortunate enough to have been in the industry for 30 years and been an educator on that side. So the more training, the better, really. But at the end of the day, I'd expect a diploma level of training to work this cohort as a minimum. You'd probably want to have a decent amount of experience before you started working with this group of people. Part of the issue is that there's so much complexity often that it can even be a little bit overwhelming, because they might have multiple issues like physical symptoms that are caused by injury, but there's also the whole psychosocial process that they've come through. It's very hard to train someone to do this work. It's better just showing up and getting on with it. I've found it's been hugely gratifying to do this work. I love it because I love it because of its complexity, and I love it because of the multicultural aspect to it. I just love mixing with other cultures and hearing their stories. And the biggest risk of working in this field is secondary trauma and taking home the story with you. And it's very important to be able to leave that at home when we go home at night.
Thanks, Barry. That's great. Devash, there's been a few questions in regards to the process when people are leaving Mangrey and going into the community to be resettled, about the support that we can provide and what that process is. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little to your role, how you manage the referrals on, and any follow-up support that we could provide.
So most people that work with us, if they're needing an onward referral, we would compile a report based on the assessment and their engagement at Mangrey. There's some information is sent through to immigration, which is fed back to Red Cross, and this would help with the support workers and individuals involved in that settlement process to be able to assist people, whether that's prioritizing language or language classes, or social engagement, or assistance with appointments for medical or psychiatric referrals that are being made on. There is also a more comprehensive report that is written to the settlement mental health services, which will include the history that's been taken with regards to either the trauma or the journey or the presenting problem, essentially, and the formulation and treatment framework that we'd consider valuable based on the presentation that has been placed forward.
Thanks, Devash. A question has come through in regards to COVID-19, which is obviously in everyone's mind at the moment, and certainly for those of us here back in Auckland, very prevalent in our lives right now. The question is really around, what have you noticed people from refugee backgrounds have been presenting with during this time, and how have you tweaked or changed your approaches to help manage to support them within this framework of this pandemic?
I don't mind getting started on that. We had an intake in February, and then lockdown came along. I think it was March, actually. So it meant that they had to be isolated for 2 weeks. And then, of course, they were there for a total of 6 weeks in lockdown. We couldn't see them. So we were relocated to the mobile team and working in Onehunga with mostly asylum seekers. So post-lockdown, we got to see our clients out there at Mangrey, and that actually had an extra level of distress, and it was quite palpable because there was an extra level of uncertainty I felt in this group. A lot of need for massage, a lot of need for extra care. They've since gone out of that community and out of Mangrey into the community, and currently there's no one at Mangrey. The place is empty apart from a couple of asylum seekers. And so most of us have been relocated to working with the mobile team over in Onehunga and working in Auckland. So that's it from my experience anyway.
I'd just like to add to that, Barry. So when Mangrey went into lockdown, although we couldn't see clients face to face anymore, we were fortunate that we were actually able to go online quite quickly. So we maintained contact with our clients, either doing teletherapy over the phone, or if they could get an internet connection, because the internet wasn't that stable, we could do WhatsApp. So we were able to maintain that connection even though they were in lockdown. In terms of my experience with the clients in the community, I've come across quite a few clients who have been re-triggered from past trauma from war, where they were kind of in lockdown during wartime and a lot of fear around that. And so those memories have been re-triggered and have been quite anxiety provoking for those clients. So that kind of took a bit more work in terms of addressing and discussing those types of issues.
And if I could just add to that, Linda and Barry, I've noticed since the COVID-19 pandemic that, yes, anxiety is up, but I also met a young girl who, she was in that February intake, and she left her country of Ecuador. When she arrived here, she had made friends with another little girl back in Ecuador, and who was meant to be travelling out to New Zealand a day or so later, but that was prevented due to lockdown, and she lost contact with that friend that she had established in Ecuador, and she talked of the guilt of being here, being safe, but she lots of wonderings about what happened to the family that got left behind. So yes, anxiety is high, but there's also that other feeling of worry for those back at home, worry for those back in their countries, their families, and for those families that are still now waiting to come to New Zealand.
Yeah, obviously I can't massage in lockdown, but I can give educative support. So educating, stretching, self-care, breathing exercises. So that's the sort of thing that we're doing currently in Auckland at level 3 lockdown.
Thanks, Barry. Delaney, do you have any reflections from your social work position about what you've been noticing out in the community during this time?
I do. Given the nature of my job, some of the things have been difficult to do, given the services are in lockdown. But I found that during this round of lockdown, services have adapted rather. So we can still get some things done because the processes are in place, but some things are not being able to. We've had to put a little temporary stop to it, and of course, this had like Linda said, it does trigger some past memories for them. In terms of the feeling of start, stop. For example, I've got a client who has been very keen to get employment since he was resettled in Auckland. But that has, and he's now at that point in his life where he can actually get work. But of course, he's had to stop that process. So when I touched base with him last week, around just the day that we went to lockdown, he's like horrible, because that sinking feeling of, oh no, I've got to wait again. So that's just one example. So for me, it's around talking to the client and saying, yeah, but in the meantime, we'll work on other things. Talk to the other services, see what we can do, get your English, improve your English and those sort of things. And here again is the collaboration with the therapist, the psychologist, to work together in holding them during this time, so they'll be better prepared when we come out of lockdown.
Thanks, Bonnie.
That's just one example.
Okay, great. Okay, there's lots of questions coming through in regards to our use of interpreters, the interpreters that are part of our team. I'll try and pull a few things together, stuff around specialist interpreters who understand the psychological terminology, how it works with an interpreter in the room, I guess, having the sense of that triadic third when we're thinking from a therapeutic perspective, and obviously the importance of the interpreters who are on our team to provide the extra support that we need. So just wondering if you wanted to reflect on any of these points and provide some feedback here.
I'd just like to say about the amazing role that interpreters provide for our service. We can't do the work without them. They're a huge source of knowledge. Working with an interpreter in session is time consuming, so what you can achieve in a session is much slower because you've got that three-way conversation. But I think our interpreters do an amazing job, and they do have an awareness of the language that we use and are able to interpret that so that their clients understand. I just think they do an awesome job.
Yes, we're very lucky because many of our interpreters are past refugees, and so they have a great understanding of the journey of the client. So they can add a lot to the understanding of what we need to work with, and add to the understanding of what the client is presenting. What I've found, just to reflect Linda, is that I'm working slower. It's actually better. So I have to wait for the interpreter to interpret something, when I say ask about pain levels or is that pressure okay, I have to wait, and then the interpreter interprets it. And actually, in fact, it's made my work better, really. It's interesting. I think we're absolutely, totally grateful for the work the interpreters do. They do an amazing job, and I think they're rather underrated in our service in some ways.
Yeah, agreed, Barry. I get a lot of support, cultural support, as well as language support. They do an amazing job out there. I would just like to add, from a perspective of the children, I do hear in the community that children are being asked to interpret for their parents, and for me that is problematic, because you're asking a child to participate in an adult world, and I would really like to emphasize that interpreters should be used widely and expansively in the community by hospitals, medical staff, whoever can get education, everybody who can get interpreters. The value that they can add is huge. So I'd just like to add that, and not to use children as interpreters.
I'll just pick up on a point that you made, Barry, about our interpreters often having a similar journey to our clients, and it does provide heaps of understanding, which is awesome. But I also think, as the clinician in the room, you have to be really mindful that sometimes they will get triggered, and so it's really important that you're also observing cues within your interpreter, just in case you might need to take a break and just check in with the interpreter, because some of the content that's being discussed can be really close to their own personal experience. So I think it's important to be mindful of that.
And also mindful of any technical terms that I might use. So I have to be careful about how they might get translated, and sometimes there is no translation for some things.
All the others took most of what I wanted to say, but I think pre-briefing with the interpreters is very important, because it gives them a heads up. And some of the, like Barry said, some of the words that we use are not very familiar. Some of, like for myself, some of the NGO names that I use are quite hard to pronounce. They're not familiar. So giving the interpreters heads up actually makes the point of the session with the client a lot smoother. And I also have to thank the interpreters, the willingness to go with me to all these random places I go with the clients, maybe home visits, winds, lawyers, doctors, whatever it might be. Yes, I'm very, very grateful for the interpreters.
I would say at Mangrey, I would use interpreters about 80% of the time, but there are a good 20% of people who have good English already. They arrive in New Zealand with good English, so it's not always interpreters. However, at the mobile team, which is in Onehunga, often I don't need interpreters, because I've often been here for 2, 5 years even, and enough English. And in fact, it's actually an advantage for them in many ways to practice their English with someone speaking English, obviously.
I wondered, Kate, if I might sum that up a little bit by talking about the importance of the therapeutic alliance that's developed in the room with the interpreter. So I guess for me, one of the most important things is not only that the interpreter has that that vocabulary set and or capacity to hold, but that we can use a consistent interpreter. So this is really comforting for the client to be able to not have to repeat aspects of their story or feel that it has been understood. And I think that that therapeutic triad, as I call it, is an essential part of it, and we wouldn't be able to do our jobs without them. Yeah.
Oh, I am mute. Thank you very much for that. That's a really thorough reflection on the work that our wonderful interpreters do, and how they're so essential to bridge that gap between ourselves and the people that we work with. Now, I am aware of the time, and I'm conscious there's a lot of questions that we haven't been able to get to. Some are really specific, and we would be great to follow up in regards to referrals, support, how we can help in the community. So I'm sure we can keep those questions and respond maybe on a one-to-one basis. But just before we wrap up here, I just wonder if the panel here have got any final reflections that they would like to add at this time.
Oh yeah, I have. I just really like to say, be kind. You know, put yourself in the refugee people's shoes, and treat them as you'd like to be treated. Because nobody chooses to be a refugee, and I think having, reflecting on it and having an understanding that actually it's just luck that we're not in that position. So I think kindness is really important.
Thanks, Linda.
I might expand on that. I guess I was reflecting, Kate, on the question that came through around COVID-19 and thinking about some of the narrative from the work the clients I did in Mangrey in March, and thinking around the idea of coming to New Zealand was described as wanting stability and security in terms of moving forward. And I guess in some ways COVID and lockdown annihilated those dreams or aspirations, and as has been said, re-triggered that sense of being captive, or but also encompasses clear, talked about that dissonance between, at that time, the relative safety in New Zealand and that sense of guilt of those people that were left behind. And so for me, it highlighted a sense of that absence of control. And I think that acquiesce of control is not exclusive to a refugee population. Now, so many of us can experience that. So this might be our opportunity to empathically understand the experience of what it's like for potential threat, to not have things within our control, that sense of being stuck, having uncertainty in what the future might feel like. And so despite it being precipitated by incredibly different circumstances, it all forms part of what the experience of displaced persons might have to navigate.
Thanks, Devash.
I'd just like to acknowledge all the other agencies that we refer to around New Zealand, for example, Red Cross. I mean, not everyone, in fact, very few refugees settle in Auckland. They're being sent all over New Zealand, and agencies doing a wonderful job in various towns in New Zealand where refugees are being settled. And it's often with very minimal resources. So in Auckland, they're very lucky that they have psychological support here, but they don't always get that everywhere. To finish off, I'd just like to express my gratitude to work with this cohort. I found it very satisfying. I've learned a lot about myself, and a very humbling experience, recognizing that people have a far harder life than I ever have, and probably ever will have. And if I can somehow be of service to these people, that's great.
Thanks,
Larry,
both.
I'd just like to say very similar thread there, that I feel very privileged to work for RAS and to have worked alongside such a broad range of colleagues and agencies, and to hear some of the amazing stories, that kind of thing. It's just an absolute privilege.
Thanks. Great. I'm really conscious of time, so I'm just going to need to quickly wrap things up here. Thank you so much for your attendance, the audience that we can't see. Thank you for sticking with us. I noticed the number haven't dropped, so hopefully we've provided some information for you today that's been of use. Thank you to my colleagues here on screen for your time today. I know we're still working hard in lockdown, so I appreciate you taking the time out of your days. And our broader team, we can see you sending us chat messages, so we appreciate your support also. Our next webinar is 8 p.m. tomorrow evening, and that's going to be looking at exploring a community perspective. So if you haven't, we ask you to sign up for that and become part of that webinar too. And once again, thank you for your time today. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your enthusiasm, and thank you so much for continuing to support this incredibly vulnerable population in the ways that you all do. Kia ora rawa atu, noho ora mai.